You get the Soviet system imposed on it, and all of those economic indicators go south, right? As well as the political indicators. And they act like as if somehow, for the first time ever, we've now thought we're going to use advanced technology to advance socialism. What I say is that if you go all the way back to the original socialists, they were always using the most advanced technology of their time was to be leveraged for their goal. So it's an amazing story about the power of freedom and the opening up of an economy to global trade, market-oriented ideas, and what the consequences are for that.
The Road to Freedom is the latest instalment of the Realities of Socialism series. It charts Estonia's journey from a burgeoning independent country to Soviet vassal states, until, finally, in 1991, it regained its independence and started the path of embracing liberty and free markets again. Hello and welcome to the IEA's YouTube channel. My name is Harrison Griffiths, and today we will be discussing this research with one of its authors, who is also Professor of Economics and Philosophy at George Mason University, Peter Boettke. Peter, thank you very much for joining me again. It's always good to have you.
It's great to be here with you.
Excellent. So, first of all, just chart a little bit what the situation was in Estonia before the Soviet Union invaded the country. How was the economy doing? Was it a relatively free society?
So it's a fascinating question because let me just start with Estonia, not so much the nation, but the culture. So Estonian culture, its language, its songs, its various different folkways goes back 5,000 years. It could be said to be one of the early European cultures. But the country was a conquered country all the time. It was conquered by the Danes. It was conquered by the Germans. It was conquered by especially Swedes. It was conquered by Russia, especially. And so it's a very ancient culture and a very young country in some sense, right? After the failed Russian Revolution of 1905, Estonia becomes sort of an independent country. And it exists in this independent status for about 19 years. And then what happens is that it then, gets conquered again, kind of idea. And then eventually what happens is that you have a once you get the Stalin-Hitler Pact, what happens there is that they claim that Europe is going to be divided. That's a secret part of the non-aggression pact, is that they're going to divide up Europe. So the first one is going to split Poland in half, but they're actually going to give to the Soviets, the Germans are going to give to the Soviets, the Baltic states plus Finland, okay? And so at first blush, after the pact, they're under Soviet occupation. And, the Soviet troops are so enormous, right, in terms of size and strength. And the Estonian, it's a country today of 1 million people or so, so it's not a huge country. It just can't fight, all the Soviet troops. And so they acquiesce, basically, right? They have appeasement policy. And so the Soviet takes over there, and they did in all the Baltic states as well. They failed to control Finland because Finland pushed back and did better resistance than the Baltic states. But so the Soviets were in control, but then, of course, the pact breaks down. And when the pact breaks down, the Germans invade. Now, what's fascinating in this story is that when the German Nazis invade, the Estonian people at first are quite happy because their Soviet oppressors were so much worse. But now, then they get the Germans involved. And then, of course, World War II happens. And then after World War II and the Germans lose, then what happens is that the Soviets then take over again, and the Soviets control for 50 years the Estonian economy. And so that's what's going on. Now, go before the occupations of Germans and Soviets. The Estonian economy was doing okay. The level of government spending in the economy was about the equivalent of what's going on in Western democracies during that period of time, the interwar years as well. So that's important to keep in mind, I think, because they're kind of doing okay, but there's still like a very high involvement of government. So government expenditures as a percentage of GDP is quite high and all these things like that. But they have relatively free trade. They're a gateway to Europe. This is, one of the things. So they actually are doing, very well compared to the Finns, right? Which is the natural comparison group that we play out in the book. So they're doing pretty well compared to the Finns. But then what happens is that you get the Soviet system imposed on it, and all of those economic indicators go south, right? As well as the political indicators. And so you get a totalitarian regime that engages in the same kind of level of deportation, collectivization. And given what I said earlier about its unique cultural heritage, one of the key things is Russification, right? Is that the Soviets try to impose upon the Estonians homogeneity about Russian culture. And they want to push down any of the notion of Estonian culture, and they want to squash it. And so, yeah, that's a long history in a very short time. Yeah,
absolutely. I think you managed to summarize quite a significant, large period of Estonia's economic history pretty succinctly there, to be honest. But I wanted to ask you. You mentioned the comparison between Finland and Estonia. That is something that, as you say, continues throughout the paper. You use that comparison to illustrate the changes in the two countries. Why is that a good comparison? Why is it important? Is it cultural? Is it similar-sized economies? Or what's the reason for that?
So, when we do comparative economics, we always are looking for comparing apples and apples, not apples and oranges, right? And so, an old book by Alvin Robushka, who was a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he wrote a book called The Two Chinas, and in that he compares mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And his argument is that relatively speaking, so not perfect, relatively speaking, they share a common cultural heritage, but they exist under different institutions. And then you can describe how the different institutions have the impact, right? So part of the whole thing with economics is that we want to move away from preference-based explanations, or what you might say today, people-based explanations. And so the fundamental equation in political economy is you take preferences, okay, and you treat them as given, all right? Then what you do is you have institutions, and then you have outcomes. And you're going to try to explain the variation in the outcomes by the variation in the institutions, not the variation in the people, right? And in that way, we can focus our energy on the institutional comparison. The reason why we do that is because we don't want to say, smart people do smart things, dumb people do dumb things. These people are better, that kind of thing. And it is true, by the way, that the characteristics of the people does matter, and I'm not denying that. But for analytics, we don't really get very far if we say, good people do good things. Like, okay, so what did I need economic theory to explain, right? And so, but if I have same people, different rules, produce different outcomes, now I can start to analyze. So now back to your point, Finland is right across about 50 miles away, right? Across the sea from Estonia. And so there's a lot of we argue there's a lot of sharedness. So they're more like apples and apples than apples and oranges. And so when you line them up and you compare them, and then you look at like what the consequences are, what is the biggest difference between what happened in Finland and what happened in Estonia during the period of time that we're doing? It's institutional changes. And so that's what we're trying to get.
The two countries are in many ways unique in terms of their cultural heritage, aren't they? You have a common language branch between the two of them. I think they converted to Christianity and converted to Protestantism at relatively similar times, stuff like that you can identify.
Imagine you put that bar over preferences, and we're like just freezing it because we assume that they're relatively homogeneous. If a real historian was looking at it, they could go in and explain a lot of differences and stuff like that. But we're economists, and we're trying to do this. We do three kind of levels of empirics in the paper. The first one is this, basically comparison between Finland and Estonia. The other one is an internal sort of time series of looking at, what happens in Estonia proper, with respect to various economic measurements, GDP growth and life expectancy, that kind of stuff. And, in that, what you're trying to do is basically, look at over time how it performs. And you have a shock that's in the system. Like, when did an event happen? Boom. And then you want to compare what was happening before and then what was happening afterwards. And then the third one is we rely on external measures. How does the world see economic freedom in Estonia over time? How does the world see personal freedom in Estonia over time? And measure that with respect to moving away from the totalitarian nightmare to, this free country kind of idea, and how they pulled that off. And, we're trying to use or leverage each three of those kind of empirical strategies to put some meat to the bones of the story. But, the real story is in the living out narrative of what actually happens in there. And these are just snapshots. Some of them are a movie picture, but mostly a snapshot looking at what kind of aspect of empirical reality we can capture.
And so what do we see? So when the Soviets reoccupied the country, I believe in 1940, you quickly see, they reoccupy the country, the Germans come back, but after the war, you very quickly see the imposition of some of the policies that students of Russian history might be familiar with.
Yeah.
Things like land collectivization, deportation and slaughter of people who disagreed with having their own farmland taken from them and the like. So what policies do we see, and what are their impacts over the period where Estonia is in the Soviet Union until 1991?
Yeah, so collectivization is obviously the most stark one, because what you do see is two things. One is as collectivization rises, decline in agricultural output, plummets, okay? The other thing is that what agricultural production that does take place is in the private plots, right? So you can also see that. So here's the big news. It's a spoiler alert. Incentives matter. And so when people have, bad incentives, they're not going to behave in the same way they do when they have good incentives for their reward. So you see it very much in collectivization, but you also see it in industrial, policy, their ability to build their industry and do those things. It's also shown up in the way in which planning operates in terms of, the output targets and the inefficiencies that are built in. So, what we try to do in the monograph is, not only play out the kind of, arguments that you see in Mises and Hayek about the issues having to do with what happens when you eliminate a price system or distort a price system, but also the examination and bureaucracy that Yanis Kornai has identified with socialist economies, where you end up with a shortage economy, you end up with an over-administered economy, and you get all of the dysfunctions that are associated with a bureaucratic system trying to allocate scarce resources. The way we summarize it in this book and in the Poland book, and to be honest with you, earlier in a book that I did with Matt Mitchell called Applied Mainline Economics, is we identify the problem as an incentive problem, a knowledge problem, and a control problem. And in the Estonia book, we really emphasize a lot the control problem, which is, the ability for the government to try to control its population, to suppress it. Part of that is because a large part of the Estonian end story is the ability of the citizens to resist, right? And so they lost the ability to control. But when you focus on that control problem, you tie right into a lot of things that Hannah Arendt discussed in The Origins of Totalitarianism. And, let's step back for a second and remember the purpose of the project, right? The purpose of this whole project that Fraser and you guys have all, instigated is because the current young generation doesn't understand the history of socialism in the 20th century. Now, a large part of that is because they weren't born, and it seems like a Charlie Chaplin film to them. So we're trying to make it become a live action film in front of them today. But the other issue is that because we've lost the history, we end up by losing that people think modifiers mean that they can escape the worst nightmares of the 20th century. So, if I just put the word democratic in front of socialism, I'm going to somehow be immune from all of the things. And part of what we're trying to point out, especially in other things, is that these modifiers were used all the time by the advocates. It's not like Lenin got there and rubbed his hands together and said, how can I have a totalitarian regime, right? He thought he was going to finally deliver liberalism, and not liberalism, but liberty and equality and justice finally to mankind through like a true democratic revolution, right? That was the idea. And so Stalinism has to be understood as an unattended, undesirable consequence of a dream aspiration that doesn't conform to reality, to the human condition. And so if we could get that message across and tell the story of this, then, we're doing something with that, and that's, I think this Realities of Socialism, the whole set of volumes that are involved in it, and the resources that have been developed, the videos and all the rest of this stuff, is just so important to try to, bring this story to life, but also to correct for misunderstandings. These modifiers don't do the job. If I could bore you for one more second, I published a paper last year on techno-socialism. And, one of the things, this is about AI and all the stuff like that. And if you listen to people, they act like as if somehow, for the first time ever, we've now thought we're going to use advanced technology to advance socialism. But if you go all the way back to
as the computing power problem, which is a real misunderstanding of the nature of Hayek's knowledge for what Hayek means as the economic calculation problem, right?
If you go all the way back, I mean, that's 100% correct. But what I say is that if you go all the way back to the original socialists, they were always using the most advanced technology of their time was to be leveraged for their goal. So, at one time it was military planning, then it became, fast forward, it became econometrics, right? And then it became, input-output tables, and then it became linear programming. Right. And then it became cybersyn, if only, these kind of cybernetics would have been able to be used. Now it's AI. And so again, the modifier doesn't solve the fundamental problem of economic organization. And we're trying to communicate that to a new generation of students so that they understand that whatever system we're in, capitalism, socialism, anarchism, fascism, whatever, they have a control problem, a knowledge problem, and an incentive problem. And the way a system works is going to be a function of how well it handles those three problems, because those are universal. Those are universal problems.
And just very quickly, could you, try and summarize in a sentence or two exactly what those three problems are?
So the incentive problem is just, the marginal benefit, marginal cost calculation of individuals as it affects to the institutional environment that they're in, whether or not, their effort is rewarded. This is the easiest way to think about it, is the relationship between effort and reward. And if the effort is not matched with the reward, then people will put in less effort, right? And that kind of stuff. That's the incentive problem. It's the number one problem that everyone brings up when you ever learn economics, right? It's like, I kid around a lot of times, say, look, the incentive argument and private property argument is the oldest argument in intellectual history. It's Aristotle's critique of Plato, right? It's like, who's going to end up by being able to, husband the resources unless they have the incentive to do so. The issue about the knowledge problem is, so the easiest way to understand that is that all systems have to allocate scarce resources among competing ends. There are technological possibilities and there are economic viability reasons. So not all ways to build a bridge are economically viable, right? So or for me to cross a bridge, for example, in London, I could catapult, right? I could just build no bridge, but just ride a rowboat. I could have submarines. I could have helicopters. The question is, what's the most economically efficient way to do that? And that means that I need to produce more with less rather than less with more. And in order to do that, I have to husband these resources. That's the incentive problem. But I also have to have the knowledge about what is the, what, how, and whom in order to produce goods and resources. And so that in a commercial society is provided for us by prices and profit and loss accounting. If I get rid of the private sector, the question is, how are you going to know what those are without prices and without profit and loss accounting, right? Political decision making, that means I reward my friends and punish my enemies, right? I mean, we've had all kinds of rationing systems throughout history. They've tried to do it, but what they don't do is they don't produce more with less. They end up by producing less with more. All right. And then finally, the control problem is that you're going to have to make sure, if I'm going to follow this plan, that people show up where I want them to be at the time I want them to be there. So we have to militarize the economy, basically. We have to militarize labor resources, because you can't, wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm going to be an intellectual that works for IEA when I need you to be working on the shop floor. And so you say, no, I want to be an intellectual that, works for IEA. And I say, no, time out. The state needs you to be here. And you say, no, I don't want to do that. And I say, okay, men are coming to arrest you tomorrow. So you do this. And so that's the simplest way to explain the interconnectedness between all three of those.
And just that's an excellent, I think, summary of the theory that underpins why this project and all the ones like it went wrong. To take it back to Estonia specifically, by the end of the Soviet period in 1991, what have we seen happen to the Estonian economy compared to its neighbours, particularly Finland? And then tell us a little bit about what's happened since, because fortunately enough, this one's got a bit of a happy ending so far, yes. Right?
Yeah. So let me just say something first about that. So I have my hands doing things. Okay. So here's Estonia. Here's Finland prior to Soviet occupation. Okay. Basically, Finland is a little wealthier. Estonia is a little wealthier than Finns. They're doing better in terms of consumer goods, everything like that. Then what happens is, it completely reverses and goes like this. So Estonia goes into the toilet, Finland continues to grow. But it's not just true for economics, also true for things like life expectancy, all kinds of other, social indicators about life. So that's what's going on. Now, post-Khrushchev, and remember the shoe, bury it, I'm going to bury you. He meant not militarily. He meant consumer good wise, right? It was the kitchen wars that, he came to the United States. He saw all these groceries and everything like that. And he said, no, socialism will outproduce. And it guided a lot of his reforms that we're going through. So they got on the treadmill of reform. Now, what they did in Soviet Estonia is that they recognized that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have a very difficult control problem for two reasons, right? One of them is their proximity to Europe. And that meant that radio frequency could come in, right? And so they could have knowledge about what was going on outside the Soviet system. So, for a while they tried to ban radios, they tried to, do all things like that. But eventually they got in their head, we can kind of turn the Baltic states into a window of what socialism promises to the West. So, they wanted to make socialism look attractive to, the other, Scandinavian states or whatever. And so they gave Estonia relative freedom relative to the other Soviet republics. So the Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia are just a little bit better than all the other, countries. Now, all right, so that's important to keep in mind as the base level. But the reality is, compared to Finland, they're still doing much poorer than what they were on track to do. And so, there's a kind of a reversal of fortune that takes place because of the socialist experiment. Now, the socialist resistance, the Estonian resistance, comes in three major revolutions in the mid to late 80s, okay? So the first one is an environmental resistance. All right. So the Soviet planners are engaged in this, industrialization that causes environmental damage, foresight. Okay. And so the Estonian people rise up that their, natural resources and whatnot, their environment is being destroyed, and they protest. And eventually what happens is the Soviets have to pull back. Okay. That's one. Second, the Russification is resistant. Mart Lahr, who's a major player in our story, he was a history teacher, and he and some fellow history teachers started to decide to develop a Estonian Heritage Society. all right, to try to bring back Estonian language, to, Estonian culture and whatnot. And they had this song festival, which goes all the way back to, the earlier efforts to reclaim an Estonian culture in the 19th century. They started this music festival every year. And when the Russians got control, they wanted to make sure that they only sang Russian songs and only dressed in Russian things. And in the late 1980s, the people decided, you know what? We're going to bring back Estonia songs, Estonian culture. And they resisted the Soviet authorities by singing. And this is called the singing revolution. And so that's, I think I'm accurate on that, 1988. So I think that the environmental protests are 87 or 86. 88, you have the singing revolution. And then in 89, what you have is basically all the Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they join hands across the Baltics to protest. Now, both the singing revolution and the holding the united hands, are triggered by the recognition of the Stalin-Hitler Pact coming up on its 50th anniversary, and the Soviets under Glasnost recognizing that it was a illegal pact, that it was not a forcing thing. And so this is what leads, Gorbachev has perestroika, which is economic restructuring, but Glasnost, which is public frankness. We have to be honest about our past. In 1987, in the Soviet Union, they were so honest about the past that they canceled the history exams because the teachers didn't know what to ask questions on. That's actually a true story. People can laugh about it, but it's hilarious because, they had all this false history, right? Remember, as Orwell says, he who controls the past controls the present. So they wanted to make sure that the past all went with them. When they admitted that the past was a false version, what the hell do we teach in our history classes? How can we grade the students on it, right?
And it's remarkable how it brings this all together, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which is kind of the death note of Baltic independence, ends up, acknowledgement of it by the Soviet authorities ends up being the catalyst for dissolution of the Soviet Union and their independence, right?
And so, we have a kind of a mythology about that as well, which is that, there's a Soviet joke. I like to rely on a lot of Soviet jokes. Crocodile, their magazine, gives us lots of good things. There was the sociologist in the UK, Davies. I can't remember his first name. It's not Steve Davies. It's someone else. But he used to tell. He has a documentary called Hammer and Sickle, which is or Hammer and Tickle, sorry, which is about like jokes in the Soviet Union that they told themselves one another. But, one of the jokes is that in 1956, when the Hungarians wanted to go free, Khrushchev sent in the tanks. In 1969, when the Czechs wanted to go free, Brezhnev sent in the tanks. In 1989, when Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia wanted to go free, Gorbachev sent in the accountants. And what they mean by that is that the Baltic state leaders, when it was admitted that the pact was illegal, they said, oh, so we're independent. And Gorbachev said, whoa, you have to pay us reparations for all the investments that we've made in your infrastructure. And they're like, no, like that. So we tend to think of it as like this kind of not tank-oriented thing. But the reality is that Gorbachev, before the hardliners, sent in paratroopers to shut down independence movements. We tend to forget that, that he, we don't always remember the iron fist of Gorbachev. So, when he first came to power in 1985, his first act was to try to impose labor discipline and crack down on alcoholism in Soviet Russia. And this one, all the way to the end, we tend to think of him as like, this like warm and peace sneaky kind of guy. That's not actually real. He wanted to impose the system. He didn't want the system to implode. And so he's going to try to keep the independence movement in check. But he had already delegitimized the reasons why they were there. So this just led to an increase of the resistance. Their own internal problems were, more and more difficult. And so the center could no longer hold, as they say. And so then you get the independence. And then the story after that is one that's really amazing and in many ways unique. Matt and I were very fortunate. We did the Poland monograph with Konstantin Zukov as well. And, Poland had Balcerowicz. And Balcerowicz, was a very knowledgeable economist and extremely committed market-oriented economist. And he put through the Balcerowicz reforms. And in the Poland monograph, we do a very, very strict event study. Balcerowicz reforms, look what happens to, per capita GDP afterwards. What was the trend line going like that? In this volume, you have a historian who read Milton Friedman, but he's not really trained economist. Okay. But he read Milton Friedman and that influenced where he was going with things. And he just adopted the just do it, policy. So, in the monograph around page 100 or so, we have a list of basically the shock therapy that they introduced. And they just did it. They just went ahead and they put the reforms in. They didn't look backwards. And they ended up by getting a flat tax. They've also, since that time, they're major technological resources. So they are one of the innovators in e-government, all these kind of things to streamline bureaucracies. But also what went with the economic freedom, which, again, you can look and where they end up in the Fraser Economic Freedom Index, is they go really high, they fall down a little bit, but they're in the top percent there. But on personal freedoms, they're like one of the top personal freedom countries in the world. So it's an amazing story about the power of freedom and the opening up of an economy to global trade, market-oriented ideas, and what the consequences are for that. I should point out, like all countries in the post-communist period, they did go through a very difficult period of time in the beginning, right? The legacy of the past is huge, as much of a window to the world that they were to see the benefits of socialism. They depended a lot on Russian subsidies, and Russia was involved deeply in their economy. When Russia pulls out, a lot of that stuff disappears. But I think this is an empirical trick that I would just like to say somewhat, because if the Soviet figures are in fact juiced up and not based on real figures. So for example, what you really should do is try to work with black market figures in the pre to post in the late communist period, because that would give you a better indicator of economic activity rather than the official statistics, and so what happens is you get basically a J curve, right? So you have a decline and then you increase. But the question is whether or not that decline really happened if you compare the real economy to the false economy that was reported on. But that's a big debate among economists and whatnot. And so I'm not saying we resolve it at all, but I just wanted to raise it out there to say that maybe they didn't go through as much of a recession as you might think if you, in fact, continue the trend line of where the economy was going south to begin with,
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. But I think amongst all of that, what you can take away is that it's no bad thing, I guess, to have a leader of a country whose only economics knowledge is Milton Friedman.
I think Matt Lahr demonstrated that, and I think it's wonderful. If I could say one last plug to your listeners, if you want to learn more about Milton Friedman, this new biography on Milton Friedman by Jennifer Burns is absolutely fantastic. And
yes.
And so
should get hold of it. Yeah. We had an event with her last night. We'll put the link to that in the description. But Milton Friedman, The Last Conservative.
Yes.
Did you say it is? Yes. That's essential piece of reading, and I'm not sure it's actually out in the UK yet. Is it out in hardback in the US?
It's out in the US, but I don't know if it's out in the UK yet. But it's a brilliant book, very well researched. If you combine her book with Caldwell's biography on Hayek, you get a very good picture of the power of the set of ideas that those two gentlemen, developed in their lifetime, and the battle that they fought to get these ideas across. So.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Peter, for joining me. If you enjoyed that video, please give it a like and subscribe to the IEA London YouTube channel. We will also put all of the Fraser Institute Realities of Socialism content in the description and include a link to Estonia, and we'll put a link into the site so that you can also have a look at the content from countries like Sweden, Denmark and Poland as well. Thank you very much for watching.